Hello everyone, I am a fourth year college student at Arizona State University studying political science, and my name is Jacob Nakar. In this video I will be discussing why the US should use military force to defeat ISIS. Now, first and foremost, we need to give some background context, and in doing so we need to define what a state actor is versus a non-state actor. So, back up a little bit before this whole ISIS ordeal. The U.S. had basically formed its policies around the Cold War, World War II, World War I, its foreign policy, that is, and that was all dealing with state actors, nations and countries that had defined boundaries, borders, and militaries that we could estimate, that we could size up, and that we could combat against. They had nowhere to run. Non-state actors, we discovered very quickly, are groups of individuals that can essentially exist within a population, within the citizens of a country or a nation, and not adhere to the policies or the desires of the said state or nation. We saw this when we were hit with 9/11 and the Twin Towers fell because of Al-Qaeda. We had insurgents come in to Iraq from that group, and we hadn't dealt with that before, essentially. Now, a lot of people don't really understand ISIS. First and foremost, when talking about ISIS, we have to understand that this group is different from Al-Qaeda. When we displaced and dissolved the Iraqi military, after we occupied Iraq with our military, we basically took thousands of Iraqis, highly trained, skilled, smart individuals. We dissolved their military, their jobs, and gave them nothing else to do. This, coupled with a dissidence and a alienation of their own government, and at least how they felt towards their own government, eventually would come to form ISIS. Now, we do have highly trained individuals. That's different from, militia fighters and, just Minutemen from, other countries. And another difference is funding. ISIS has been the biggest funded and the most well-funded terrorist organization that we've had to deal with. We have the Saudi individuals, rich, wealthy Saudi individuals, and some speculate that there are fundings and funds coming in from Saudi Arabia that fund ISIS as well. And a large amount of their revenue comes from their oil trade, which the EU just buys up. So, with that said, they have no trouble with funding. They've got the funds and the tools. They declare themselves as the Islamic State, and they have borders that are enforceable on their standards. Of course, they've been in decline when it comes to nowadays, but they do have borders, territories that they've fought over, and then also contested territories that they do not have complete control of. And they tax the citizens and the people living there whereof, just like a normal nation would. Okay, another point that we need to get to is where they're coming from, what their ideals are, and what they want. They essentially wish to establish a caliphate and put a caliph at the head of it all. Al-Baghdadi, the leader, has essentially established himself as the said leader, and their hope is to essentially unite the Muslim world under Sharia law and spread Muslim doctrine thereof. The problem with this, as we know, not all Muslims are violent, but the scriptures that they take do justify violent acts. And we've seen that with how they uphold Sharia law. Now, let's go to Iraq in 2007. President Bush had to decide in his last term whether or not to make a strategic fallback and a retreat and pull out of the Middle East completely, cut his losses. It's a bad situation, but it could get worse, or to send in even more troops in hopes of improving the situation. This was known as the surge. He decided the latter and essentially took a ton of troops and put them in Iraq. And when he handed the presidency over to the Obama administration, violence against American soldiers were down 90%. And President Obama even spoke to the troops in Iraq and talked about how it was a great milestone to see Iraqis come so far after, an overture of government and just reformation basically within their country. President Joe Biden supported this as well. He said and suspected that this one issue, Iraq that is, would be one of their greatest achievements for their presidency. So right after that, one of Obama's biggest things was about taking soldiers out of the Middle East, and like we didn't belong there anymore, just pulling them all out. When we got out of there, I believe it was in 2010, someone might correct me, but in that time of his first term of presidency, things kind of went south, completely went south, and it's not that the U.S. has bad power. That we're at the forefront of military power, but we failed at the fourth and fifth stage of the cycles of war. I'm gonna get this one wrong, but that's essentially stabilization and enabling civilians to restructure their government and to support their government without our help anymore. Empowering the civil system. Okay. So with the retreat of our troops and increase in soft power and diplomacy, we saw the rise of ISIS instead of the decline and more stability. Let's go to the stakes. So between 2001 and 2014, with Operation Enduring Freedom, we had about 2,300 American soldiers die, and these are rough estimates, let's keep that in mind. And with Operation Iraqi Freedom, from 2003 to 2010, we had about 4,400 troops die. So there's definitely blood that's been spilled, and we have skin in the game here. We've spent $7.6 trillion on defense since 9/11, and we've seen an increasing amount of terrorist attacks on the home front, as well against our allies in the Middle East. Israel is the biggest ally we have in the Middle East, and they're the only democracy in the Middle East. There's no reason why we should be running away and not supporting them. That's another debate, though. Okay. Also, ISIS declares war on us openly, on the U.S., on our allies, and even though we do not recognize them as a state actor, they are still somewhat of a hybrid because they have the funding that a state actor would without actually being a solid state or nation. And us just saying, well, they're not a state or a nation doesn't actually change anything. Us saying that, well, we're not actually at war with them doesn't change anything. The fact is that we are at war. They are very open about their mission, and they are very expressive of their mission, especially when it comes to killing people, Americans. So options, diplomacy would be the first option. Soft power, no troops, The problem is we saw that in 2010 and 2016, and it failed tremendously. We saw that as the rise to ISIS, the power vacuum that we left there in the Middle East, and the security vacuum filled by both Iran with different proxy terrorist groups and with ISIS. Option B, we have an aggressive military campaign, tear them down, tear down their foundation, just bomb the heck out of them. The problem with that is it creates more insurgents. We see that every time we've made a big airstrike, something where a lot of casualties are caused, something that really affects ISIS heavily, we see that the insurgent numbers that are recruited skyrocket. And they use these events as publicity and propaganda. They use this as an immense amount of propaganda here. That's how Zarqawi used all these situations to his benefit. The third approach, and the one that I'm suggesting, is one of a more fusionist approach rather than a purist approach. I do agree with an intense military campaign, boots on the ground, airstrikes, military support, really crank that heat on high, but we don't need to do it for such a long time. If we're going to do it, let's get in it and let's get it done. Go 100%. And at the same time, we need to be funding groups that are fighting alongside us, like the YPG, the Kurds. They're one of our biggest allies in the Middle East when it comes to fighting ISIS. And they do a lot of work with very little resources. And lastly, I think this is a really important key here. We need to work to heal old wounds between the Shia and the Sunni. This is a very big undertaking, but this is the reason why we have groups like ISIS and the support thereof. You have Iraq, which has been the majority population is Sunni, and then the government is minority controlled Shia, just like in Syria. So there's no reason why we can't implement programs to, whether it's eventual military exercises alongside different countries. We've done that with the Israelis and the Jordanians and the I believe the Egyptians. And we should be supporting a long-lasting, a long-term policy rather than just a short-term one. Thank you.